Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters. Chapters is the show that profiles authors, editors, and publishers in the tri-state area, including West Virginia, Kentucky, and Ohio, and sometimes points beyond. We're delighted to have you today. I'm Carter Seaton, your host, and our guest today is Jess Montgomery. She is the author of the Kinship Historical Mystery Series, which begins with The Widows, and will soon be followed by the sequel, The Hollows. When will that come out?
January 14th, 2020.
2020, all right. Under her given name, Sharon Short, she is also a newspaper columnist who focuses on the literary life, authors, and events in Dayton, which is her hometown, for the Dayton Daily News. She's also the executive director of the renowned Antioch Writers Workshop in Yellow Springs, Ohio. The Widows garnered awards even before it was published. The Montgomery County Arts and Culture District awarded her an Artist Opportunity Grant for Literary Arts. She also got the John E. Nance Writer in Residence Award for Thurber House in Columbus, and her book was just named a all counties, one read,
one read,
all counties.
one community.
And
in
that was
northwestern Ohio.
And that was The Widows, right?
The Widows,
The
yes.
Widows.
Yes.
Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. We're delighted to have you.
I'm happy to be here.
So you do write under a pen name.
I do.
What made you decide to do that?
My previous novels were either comedic mysteries and contemporary, and then there was one novel that was sort of a novel of the heart, a coming-of-age novel set in the 50s. That was kind of a literary novel, if you will. And The Widows certainly combines mystery and literary language, but it's set in the far more distant past. In the 20s, it's told from two different points of view. It's third person rather than first person, which the other books were. And so it's enough of a departure from the sensibility of my previous work that my agent thought it made sense to have a pen name, so that's why.
And it also distances you somewhat from your journalistic career.
Right, that is
So
true.
that's maybe a little bit of an advantage as well.
A little bonus, yes.
Yeah, a little bonus as well. Does being a journalist inform your writing?
Oh, now that's an interesting question, which no one has asked me before. So well done. Does it inform my creative writing? I guess it does, in the sense that I interview a lot of people for the print format, so I'm constantly curious about other people's experiences and their points of view, and how that might differ from my own experience. So that's certainly part of being a fiction writer. Is, you're creating
Somebody that's not
somebody
you.
that's not me, that's pulled from me in pieces, but isn't me. And then also the research aspect is the second. There are actually three things now that I think about it. I don't feel as intimidated by research as I might if I hadn't had the journalistic experience. And then the third part is that my column is due every week, and so there's a discipline to you're going to write, whether you feel like it or doesn't really matter if you feel like it. You're just gonna. And so I've applied that to fiction writing as well.
Yeah. So you do write every day?
I do, except Sundays. I try to take Sundays off, and if I've been really productive, I'll take the whole weekend off.
Oh, wow. Give yourself a bonus.
Give
huh?
myself a bonus, yeah.
So your books are, like you said, set in a historical time frame, in the 20s, basically,
Right.
the ones that you've written so far.
Right.
What drew you to that? You talk about in, I think, one of your afterwards, about the problems of the past being repeated. Is that what really made you think about writing in that time frame, so that you weren't dealing with contemporary issues, but that they were similar?
That actually was kind of a bonus that I realized as I started writing this series. I came across the true first female sheriff of Ohio, Maud Collins, 1925, and was just really struck by a female sheriff that early on in our history. The next female sheriff in Ohio, at least, was in 1976, so it was a 51-year gap. I think female sheriffs are still pretty rare, not uncommon, but still rare. And I was just really drawn to what if there were a female sheriff in that time and place when we have suffrage has just given us the right to vote, and there's moonshining, and there's, all these social justice issues, and she doesn't know, who killed her husband, because in real life Maud did know. She sadly witnessed it, and that just sparked my imagination, and I went from there. So I didn't set out to. I've always kind of loved the 1920s, but I didn't set out to write about the 1920s. It's like the story kind of found me, and I followed it.
Yeah.
So.
Where did you come across Maud Collins?
I came across Maud Collins because our younger daughter went to Ohio University in Athens, Ohio, and Maud was the sheriff in Vinton County, which is adjacent. And I was actually, honestly, just looking for places to go hiking with her that she would find interesting, because she majored in outdoor education and played rugby. So she's a lot more physically active than I am. And I also wanted places that, I wouldn't keel over.
Yeah.
So I was doing some research to try to find some appropriate hiking places. And that's how I came across Vinton County, just Googling around, places to hike or rural settings.
So how did that, again, hiking and finding Maud Collins don't sound like they would be in the same Google search.
Well, because Vinton County has a lot of rural areas to visit and state parks and whatnot, and I just happened across their visitors' website at the same time that they said, and look, here's a photo of Maud Collins. We're very proud of her. So it was truly happenstance. So, yeah.
So do you know the work of Julia Keller?
I do,
Yeah.
yes.
Well, so she reminds me, your character, Lily Ross, reminds me a little bit of Julia's Belpha Elkins.
Yes.
So while her character is not based on a specific person, the name is the name of her aunt.
Oh.
So, but you
Nice.
have found someone that maybe there is a real life Lily Ross. I mean, she's not the same story,
No,
of
not
course,
the
but
same
it's
story at all.
same
Yeah.
kind of law enforcement
Yeah.
job, that sort of thing.
Right.
When you talk about your other women, in particularly, I guess it's
Marvina.
the widows. Yeah, Marvina, Nana, Mama. Do you have role models for them as well?
I do. Mother Jones is I would say, intellectual role model for Marvina.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, very, very much so. But Marvina's life and Mother Jones's life are very different. But spiritually, if I can use that word, and intellectually, definitely drew my inspiration from Mother Jones.
Their passion.
Their passion and their fire and their beliefs, which I am on board with. And then Mama and Nana are some of my aunts.
Oh, that's nice.
And Mama's a little bit me. I'm a little bit Lily too, but I have adult daughters now, and they're very adventurous young women. So I'm a little bit of Mama going, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So I put myself in that role
Right.
a little bit.
Can you they talk about authors having what they call the elevator speech, which means you can describe your novel in, the length of time it takes for the elevator to go
Right.
to your floor.
Right.
Give us the elevator speech for both of these.
Oh boy, in all the years that I've developed elevator speeches, I've never given that speech in an elevator. But,
No,
but here
probably
we go.
not. Right.
So The Widows is inspired by the true first female sheriff in 1925 in Ohio, in Appalachia area of Ohio, and by the labor union movement. And in this tale, two women from close geographically but very different backgrounds come together to solve the murder of the sheriff, Daniel Ross. And at the same time, like I said, we weave in social justice issues, coal mining workers' rights, unionization, et cetera. Yeah.
And The Hollows?
The Hollows starts in 1926, so about a year after the events in The Widow's end. And at this point, Lily very much wants to run for sheriff in her own right. Rather than in a special election, she wants to win in her own right. And she has some depression over this because she loves her job as sheriff and realizes she would not have had that job had her husband not died. So she's dealing with that, and at about the same time, an elderly woman is killed on a railroad track near what in real life is Moonville, Ohio. I renamed it Moonvale, Ohio. And she investigates that murder and realizes, as people are telling her, we don't really know who she is, you could just let it go. She realizes, if she's going to be sheriff for everyone, that means everyone. Every individual human matters. So that is her quest. And it's also told from the point of view of Hildy, her friend, who has her own character arc in this story. And we pull in the asylum that was in Athens, Ohio, and some shocking political underpinnings that were going on at the time in across the country. So, yeah.
All right, now, what inspired that book? Was it the asylum?
No, what inspired that book was finding out about Moonville, Ohio. Actually, my husband was sort of Googling around. Google must be the source of our inspiration of southeastern Ohio places to visit that we hadn't been. And Moonville popped up, and he's like, wait a minute, there's this now abandoned town that existed only for trains to come through. This man owned this land, and the railroad, the coal companies and the railroads at the time said, we want to buy your land and put a blast through a tunnel and put a railroad through. And he said, how about if I lease it to you? Smart man. And that developed a small town of about 100 people. And the only way that this town was ever accessible was by foot, train, or mule.
Well, sounds a little like Thurmond, West Virginia.
Okay, but people lived there up until the 50s, and the train kept going through until like the early 80s. So I was really fascinated by this setting, and we went and found the tunnel. We didn't hike across the creek to get to the abandoned village, but the setting really kind of inspired it, and it's kind of a spooky setting, which got me to thinking about, just a handful of miles away, we have a former asylum. How could we pull those two together? So the Hollows ended up being inspired by setting, really.
Yeah, that's great. So you were talking about this just a minute ago, and I wanted to ask this question. Do authors find stories, or do stories find authors, in your opinion? Or does it work both ways?
I think it can work both ways. I know when I started writing, what I knew was I wanted to be a writer. Period. And I knew that from a young age. And so I actively looked for stories. I was the person, like many writers, who, read the newspaper and kept clippings. I still have some of those clippings, just to try to find an idea somewhere, anywhere. But maybe it's because I've been writing for so long, now it feels more like, as woo-woo as it sounds, the ideas kind of find me, or at least I have to cross paths with an idea, and it's almost this gut feeling, this sort of visceral reaction of, oh, that's the rabbit hole we're going to go down for the next few years. Okay, fine. Well, we'll take that trip.
Yeah.
So
I can understand that. I've had that same sort of feeling, is that something presents itself, and it's just like, wow, I got to explore that.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's good. You have written both of these novels in alternating person voices.
Right.
What made you decide to do it that way? Because that seems to be something that more and more books are written that way. I've noticed just recently, and up until then, the only one I really knew about was As I Lay Dying. But I've noticed a number of books recently. Faulkner a long time ago. Now they're doing this more and more. What made you do that?
Well, it took me a while to get there. The first drafts of The Widows were only from Lily's point of view, and then I realized, hey, wait, you created this town called Kinship And this story, this novel, this world is about community, and it's also about the tension between individual wants and needs and the wants and needs of the community. And in exploring that tension, I realized, well, Lily can be, she is the sheriff, she's going to be the sheriff in these books. So she's at the center of the community when a crime happens. But other people are involved too. What
Sure.
about their point of view? And so I think it gives it a richer, deeper feel, and does make it more about community and different ways of looking at the world. You know, the way Lily as a female sees the world is different than Marvina, and it's different than how Hildy sees the world. And in the book I'm working on now, it's different than a character I won't name just yet sees the world in a very different way. So I like having that tension symbolically and also between the characters.
So you're comfortable with that kind of framework
yeah,
when you use it in the next book?
Yes, yes. As long as these books keep going, I would anticipate that there would be a prologue that kind of sets the theme and the idea of the overall community and how events are going to rattle the bigger community, and then alternate between Lily and person to be decided upon later.
Yeah, right, I understand. We talked just a little bit about research, that you weren't intimidated by it. Do you do your research before you write the book, or as you go, or both?
I do it as I go, but when I first start a book, I do what I call sort of creating infrastructure. I do a lot of like what's the character arc going to be, what's the background of the individual characters, an overall idea of the plot, not chapter by chapter at all, but an overall, like, I'm going to hit these markers at these points in time in the book. And while I'm doing that, I'm of course researching. And then I tend to do a lot of my research up front, but then as I'm writing, I double check, I try to double check everything. And I try to keep good notes and files and lists of links, and I have a whole bookshelf of nothing but books for the research I do for my novel writing. So.
Right. Do you always know where your story's going when you start it?
I always think I do.
Yeah.
And then I get to, within 30 pages at the end, and then I realize, that's not who done it. So what are we going to do now?
Really?
That happened with both books.
No
Yeah,
kidding.
no kidding. Yeah, a little bit of a panic attack on those moments. And so for the third book, I just decided I wouldn't know. That I would
Wow.
know who all the suspects and the motives were, who the suspects were and their motives, and then hope that when I get to that last 30 pages,
That the real
a light
purple
bulb
makes
goes
sense,
up
huh?
and announces to me who the killer is.
Wow.
So
That
either
is risky.
either it'll be brilliant or it'll go down in flames. I don't know which, but thank goodness for rewrites.
Yeah, well, you can always go back and make a decision and then
Yes,
change it, I guess.
absolutely,
Yeah, that's
yeah.
true. Yeah, that's interesting. I've had discussions with many people as to whether or not they outline, or they, at least, like you said, know the story arc and know how it's going to end. It's fascinating to listen to different people's points of view on that. Yeah. Do you typically, some people avoid reading in the genre that they write while they're actively involved in a novel, in a book. Do you do that, or do you read other mystery?
Well, if I did that, I would never get to read in my own genre because I'm always writing, and I think it's really important to know the literary world in which you're participating. Now, I will say if I'm, pushing up against a deadline, or I'm really into it, or if I'm feeling, which writers will do, feeling like, oh, I'm really terrible at this. Why did I ever think I could do this? That is not a good time to go read a master in the field. But I do love to read both in my genre and outside of my genre. Julia Keller is a great example. Denise Roy is a great example. I love Laura Lippman's books. Anything she writes, I want to read. William Kent Kruger is a master of the genre. So there are so many great mystery novelists working, and it's an honor to, be among them. So.
What do you read when you read outside your genre?
I try to read some poetry for a few minutes each morning. I'm not a poet. I'm a terrible poet when I've tried to write poetry. But I love poetry, and I love that it connects me back to these are your paints. These are your musical notes, the words, the love of language. So I have to discipline myself to read like one or two. So I'm reading poems by Mary Oliver right now.
Yeah.
And then I am looking forward to reading, I read John Steinbeck. I usually reread The Pearl at least once every year or two. That's my favorite novel of his. And then, I like to read some of the other classics again. And then I like to read really well written women's fiction. I'm not sure I'm a fan of the name of that genre, but for example, Julie Kibler's Home for Erring and Outcast Girls is one that I'm reading now that I'm really loving. So there are a lot of amazing novels out there to read.
You said you always wanted to be a writer from the time you were a child. Did you major in English, or was that just like from really young age?
It was from really young. I was like 6, and I wrote a book called The Fireman about a fireman rescuing a cat from a tree for a little girl. And then I bound it in construction paper, and I sold it to my aunt for a penny. And years later, I got it back. Yeah. So it's just always this impulse to write. I think storytelling is part of everybody's DNA, but for me, writing was something I always wanted to do. And I did major in English. Yeah, but I majored in English literature, and then...
Yeah, that's back a long time ago. That's basically all they offered. There
Right.
wasn't creative writing.
I had one creative writing class, and then I majored, I have my master's degree is actually in technical communication. Because I wanted a corporate job, so it made sense to get a master's degree in that. So I do think studying literature, I think writers should be able to understand why a text works or doesn't, so and be able to make an argument for or against that. Not just say I liked it, but to give reasons why and analyze it and look at themes. And certainly my undergraduate degree helped me with that. So I think that's a great way to go.
Yeah. What would people be surprised that you have read,
Surprised that I've read.
or that you like to read?
I like fantasy and science fiction. I think people might be surprised by that.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I obviously anything by Ray Bradbury. So again, referencing the classics. But a contemporary writer whose work I love is John Scalzi. He's also an Ohioan, and his output is amazing, but also very thoughtful and deep. So if people are out there wondering, I don't think I'd like science fiction, I think they should read John Scalzi, and I think they should start with his novel Red Shirts. So.
Do you ever write short stories, or have you ever considered short stories?
I do, yeah. They don't tend to be mystery short stories, but I have written and had published some short stories that have appeared in literary magazines. So, and I like to write those. Just take just a little nugget of human experience and present it, in a surprising way.
Do you consider your books Appalachian in flavor?
Yes, very much so. I mean, they're set in Appalachia in southeastern Ohio. My family of origin were all tobacco farmers in eastern Kentucky. I'm the first non-Kentuckian in my family of my generation, and I kind of grew up steeped in. I did grow up steeped in all the tradition and lore, and even though I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. My parents would say, "Oh, we're going down home," and that meant Eastern Kentucky. So, in a way, it was kind of like coming home to write this, because for a long time I felt like I couldn't embrace that because I grew up in Dayton, which has a lot of Appalachian people in it, but I didn't geographically grow up in Appalachia. And then as I started writing this, I realized, I can embrace that part of my cultural identity, and it's fine. So.
Sounds a little bit like the book that's quite controversial about I can't remember the name of it now. My mind just gone blank. But the one written by,
And Hillbilly Elegy?
yes, Hillbilly Elegy. Yes, thank you. Obviously, he didn't grow up in Appalachia.
Right.
But that's where he set his memoir. And
Yeah,
I know
and-
there's a
yeah.
lot of controversy about whether or not that was, should have been called an Appalachian Elegy.
Yeah, I mean, it's his story to tell, and it's a memoir, so it's his point of view.
Yeah.
So,
Right. So, I appreciate you being here today. This has been fascinating. I wonder, you can't give us any hints onto what's coming next.
besides the Hollows?
No, but when the Hollows comes out, I'm sure you're going to be inundated with dates to
I hope
go
so.
promote it and so
I
forth.
hope
You
so.
think
Yeah.
we'll have any idea where you're going to be?
Oh, yes. Well, in Dayton, I have a book launch on January 15th. It's 7 p.m. at Books & Co. And then I'm going to the Pulpwood Queens Girlfriend Weekend in Jefferson, Texas.
Wow.
Yeah, so that will be fun. So look up the Pulpwood Queens Girlfriend Weekend. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of writers, and it's book clubs from Texas, but also from across the country that get together and just, we all just share our love of books and reading. It's a lot of fun. And then in March, I'll be at the Tucson Festival of the Book in Arizona. I'm very much looking forward to that. So.
Great. Are you part of a writing group, and do you have other writers that you share, that sort of workshop your work with you?
I have really close writing friends who would, at this point, be friends even if we all just said, forget it, we're not writing anymore. I can't imagine any of us doing that. But I'm not part of a writing group, but I have 4 very close writer friends. And occasionally I'll ask them to read a few pages, and sometimes they'll ask me to read their work. It's always a yes if they ask.
Sure.
And it's always a yes if I ask, which is a real blessing. But in terms of a formal writing group, I don't. No.
And then did you have beta readers that looked at your work beforehand? That sometimes writers and readers are a very different animal.
Yes, that's true. My agent read along and her, one of the ladies that works for her, read along very closely on The Widows, and then also The Hollows. And obviously my editor works very closely with me as well. And I've had a few, in early drafts for The Widows, I did have a few readers. They're all acknowledged in there. Actually, now that I think about it, it's way more than a few. Read and give me their feedback. Because it was such a departure from what I'd written before. I really wanted reader input as well.
And who's your publisher?
Minotaur Books.
That's great.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Yes, yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Well, it's been such a pleasure to have you here. I want to thank you again for coming, and we look forward to what's coming next, and hope that The Hollows is as big a success as The Widows has been.
Thank you.
And we also want to thank the Inner Geek for being our supporters and our hosts to let us be here to tape this show. Many of the books from authors who have been on chapters are here at the Inner Geek, and we urge you to do your shopping here, and especially as the holidays approach. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time on Chapters.
Connect with Chapters via email. Write to lp4@zoom.email. Chapters has a Facebook page at Armstrong Chapters. Like, subscribe, and follow. All chapter episodes are available on YouTube. Visit Armstrong's YouTube channel. Follow Armstrong. And look for a playlist of all the Chapters programs.